A Good, Keen Man, Barry Crump. Chapter 1, I Become a Deer Color. Trevor trod heavily about the hut in unlaced boots, building a fire and swinging the first tea-billy of the day. While he waited for it to boil, he stood in the hut doorway, yawning misty breaths and watching the light sifting down the valley through the dark bush and across the open river flats. I sat up in my bunk and looked through the window as the night dissolved into a morning that had not yet decided to be fine. My pup Flynn looked in to make sure I was still there. A burning mug of strong tea was shoved at me, followed by a slab of bread, smeared with golden syrup, and black prints of Trevor's unwashed hands. When we'd eaten, Stan and Pat showed signs of moving, so I swung my legs over the edge of my bunk, peeled off my sleeping bag, and started uncertainly on my first day as a deer color. Outside, Stan showed me a few of the landmarks and drew maps on the ground with a stick that kept breaking. The landmarks might have been useful if I'd been able to remember what he said about their relation to the river, but the maps had me properly bluffed. I kept nodding and saying, "Yes, yes, hell, oh yes, does it," until his map brought him up against the side of the hut, with only 3 inches of stick left. "You get that?" he asked. "Yes," I lied, staring helplessly at what looked like an excellent likeness of a grove of supplejack. You can't get bushed if you watch the ridge system of the watershed. And don't panic when you miss your direction, he said. If you follow water, you must come out somewhere within 2 or 3 days. It was the only piece of his advice I remember, or needed to remember. By the time we left camp, the light was strong, and the others said it was too late to catch the early morning deer. But I wasn't going to be put off by that. I loaded my new .303 and almost ran up the river bed, with enough ammunition to conduct a minor war rattling in a sugar bag on my back. Flynn whined about being left behind, but I wasn't having a noisy pup spoil my chances. Turning up a side creek, I slowed a bit and sneaked along, wondering what a real deer looked like, and what I was going to do if I saw one. In the creek bed there were plenty of tracks, but the deer appeared to have climbed into the bush that grew steeply on either side. I crept forward, cursing myself every time I rustled a leaf, rattled a stone, or splashed too loudly in the water. The silence of the bush gradually made itself felt, and when a pigeon shirred up out of a conini, I almost dropped my rifle. The sling swivel squeaked, so I padded along, holding it tight with my free hand. Stones rattled loose in the bush above me, and I spun around, but my foot slipped on a wet log, and I sat heavily in the creek. Frantic, I worked the bolt of my wet rifle and scrambled to my feet. A skinny old sow trotted out of the crown fern above me, on the far side of the creek. She looked briefly in my direction and trotted away round the corner. I rolled myself a damp cigarette. In 3 hours I'd worked well up towards the creek head. I'd caught 2 glimpses of something through the bush. I'd slipped down a bank and belted my knee on a rock. I'd been lassoed by a rope of bush lawyer, the vine tearing across my neck like barbed wire, and I'd discarded the creeping idea as being decidedly unsafe. I plowed through the groves of canini and fern with all the subtlety of a dislodged boulder. Fresh deer tracks crossed and recrossed the gullies, but I concluded that the noise of my progress had frightened the deer themselves away for the day. Then I saw one. The hind, still and gray, stared down at me through a tangle of vines and branches. Curiosity or something kept her there, while I closed the bolt and aimed in her direction. It was only in her general direction, because the rifle wouldn't stay steady. My legs seemed to be quivering, and my arms followed suit. The hind bounced off through the trees, as I wasted the shot on empty air. I ran after her and loosed off a shot without aiming properly, which dropped her in her tracks, and from an almost impossible point of fire. Some people might have called it a fluke, but I happily hacked the skin off my first deer and carried it and a hind leg back down that awful little creek. There was nothing to this deer-culling business. I'd never been so bone-weary or foot-sore or happy as when I sat by the fire that evening and told and retold a bored Stan, an exasperated Pat, and an unconscious Trevor how I'd shot that old hind in the creek head. They didn't know how important that deer was to me. That night I lay in my hard wooden bunk, listening to the bush noises, and wondering whether life as a deer culler went on being like this. It had started 2 days before, when I'd trickled into the Internal Affairs Department in town to ask about a job, shooting deer for the government. I'd been sent to see a bloke called Jim Reed, who had a little office at the back of the building. He was about 45 and looked as fit as a buck rat. Parked in the yard was a light truck with Wildlife Branch painted on the door. Underneath it, 3 dogs rested quietly in the shed. Jim Reed was the kind of man who only talked when he had something to say. After a job, son. Yes, sir. How old are you, lad? 18, I said, adding 2 years. He wrote on a bit of paper. Done any hunting before? Too right. Been after goats and pigs in the Hanwas for years. You'll find deer a bit different from that sort of stuff, he said. You got any dogs? Yes, picked up a pup off a rabbiter at Topo on my way through. Okay, he said. You fill in this form and take it round to the main office. They'll fix you up with the rest. Then you'd better come back here while I work out what we're going to do with you. Oh, and by the way, you'd better tell them you're 19, 18, a bit young for this caper." A clerk in the front office had given me a hand to fill in the application form, and asked who my next of kin was in case of accidents. "Right, you've had it," he'd said, and sent me round the back again. Jim Reed had given me instructions how to get to a base camp near the headwaters of the Wacatane River, and an envelope to hand to the field officer when I got there. He'd also handed me a list of the gear I'd need, half of which I found later was superfluous. Then he'd unlocked a storeroom that reeked of unvarnished wood, grease, and gun oil, and helped me select a rifle, an ex-Army Lee Enfield, from a rack which held about 20. "We pay you £7.10 a week, and 10 bob a skin," he'd said. "5 bob if you just bring in the tails. You'll get 5 shillings a week, dog money, if your pup turns out any good. We supply all the ammunition, but if you use more than 3 rounds a kill, you pay for them. Anything else you want to know before I boot you out of here?" "No, sir." I'd hitched a ride by timber truck, and arrived at the base camp, not far from the end of a mill road, the next afternoon. Nobody was about, so I'd dumped my gear in the hut and had a look round the place. 8 deer skins and 2 tails hung on rails under a large canvas tent fly just inside the bush. The hut consisted of 4 walls made of slabs from the mill, with a roof and chimney of rusty corrugated iron. 4 bunks in 2 tiers stood against the back and end walls. A table and door took up most of the 3rd wall, and a fireplace all of the 4th. A blackened billy over the dead ashes of the morning's fire held stewed dregs of tea. Outside the valley looked gray and wintry, and a stack of firewood stood waist-high beside the chopping block. There was little enough to see. Flynn had sniffed around, getting excited whiffs of all the dogs, which had recently lived there. I'd sat on the wood block, dredged out the letter Jim Reed had given me, and worked the flap open with my knife. The note read, "Stan, this is Barry Crump. He looks to me like a good, keen man. Give him a workout and let me know how he gets on. Regards, Jim. P.S. It might be worth putting in another camp at the head of the river. They were getting quite a few deer up there this time last year." I couldn't get the flap of the envelope to stick back again, so I'd tucked it in and hoped Stan wouldn't notice. 3 blokes had come down a track by the river just on dark, and introduced themselves as Stan, the field officer, and Trevor and Pat, who were shooters. They'd been surveying country or something, and Pat had got a stag. We'd fed on boiled spuds, venison steaks, and tinned peas, with bread that Pat had baked in the camp oven. Trevor had baked another loaf after tea to show me how it was done. He'd forgotten to wash his hands before kneading the dough, but none of the others appeared to notice. Pat and Trevor had complained of how few deer were about, but Stan had said they were always a bit late moving into the area. Pat was leaving the job and had only been waiting till they'd got a new mate, for Trevor before going. Stan hadn't seemed to notice anything wrong with the note when I gave it to him. He'd read it in silence, then gone to sort out some tentage which Trevor and I would take for the new camp at the head of the river. I'd wondered where Stan's truck was, why Pat was throwing the job in, and whether Trevor ever had a wash. Months passed before I learnt what a deer culler's life really was, but the morning after my first deer, I knew that Pat was leaving because he didn't like the life, that Stan's truck was parked down the track at the mill, and that Trevor still hadn't been near a basin of water. Stan was taking Pat into the village, and then going to spend a few weeks with some shooters on the other side of the range. Trevor and I loaded the tentage and some stores into our packs, ready to go upriver to the site of the new camp. I was looking forward to the trip, keen to get in amongst the deer. But as soon as Stan and Pat disappeared down the track towards the mill, Trevor unloaded his pack, took his boots off, and lay on his bunk with a book. "Might as well take it easy for a day or two now that Stan's gone," he said. "He's been pushing us a bit lately." I hunted in the bush round the hut and up the river for nearly a week before Trevor had recovered sufficiently from his pushing to pack the gear up to the new campsite. I'd only got 6 deer and a pig by this time, but Trevor hadn't bothered to leave the camp, so I supposed we didn't have to get many to keep the department happy. We erected our camp on a bush flat 4 hours upriver from the hut. Trevor chose the spot because there were poles for the frame there, though there were plenty of better places for wood and water. I'd been farther up the river than this on one of my hunting trips from the hut, and it was a long way from the head of the valley. But I didn't say anything because Trevor had been on the job for 3 months and was head man of the party. That evening he shot a stag on the river flats and entered 3 tails in his part of the day book. I got 2 hinds in a side creek and was credited with 1 skin. When I pointed out the discrepancy, he said, "Oh yes, that's right. I'm not much good at figures, you know. Always making little mistakes like that." I kept a pretty close eye on his figuring from then on. Next day I built a pole chimney round the fireplace and lined it with flat stones from beside the river. Then I made myself a bunk with split pongus and manuka brush. Trevor cleaned his rifle and told me about a motorbike he once had. That evening I went out and brought in 2 more skins. Under my watchful guidance and with an air of offended dignity, Trevor entered them correctly in the day book. We stayed at the top camp for 2 weeks, hunting the river flats in the early mornings and late evenings, and side creeks, and bush during the days. Or rather, I hunted because Trevor slept, lying on the ground for lack of enough energy to build himself a bunk. After I got to know the country a bit and became accustomed to all the walking, I really enjoyed the work and couldn't understand Trevor's lethargic attitude. When we returned to the hut at the road for more supplies, Stan was there. By this time I had 23 deer skins and 4 pig tails, which seemed fairly satisfactory, but according to Stan, the blokes across the range were getting that many each week. He showed me how to fill in the daybook and the weekly reports on the party's activities, and told me he and I were going to spend a few days cutting a track from the hut up a ridge to the top of the range. Trevor got the sack for not getting enough deer. The department was not kept happy that easily. Flynn becomes a pig dog. Track cutting was a much more complicated thing than I'd imagined it to be. First, we had to go along armed with short-handled slashers, nicking light blazes in the trees where we found the best grade and the right direction. Then we cut our way back to where we'd started from, hacking a wide track with deep permanent blazes, so that we couldn't miss a turning in any kind of weather. Ferns, vines, and branches had to be completely cleared to a width of 6 feet, and in some places the track had to be benched into the side of the hill with axe and spade and paved with pongus. Flynn spent the days casting around in the bush while we worked. The pigs in that area were few and flighty, and when he started barking, I'd drop my slasher and be halfway down the ridge before it hit the ground. Once I went waltzing into a hollow to find that Flynn had stumbled accidentally upon a vicious old razor-backed boar, which was just starting to froth at the mouth and grind its tusks. I backed away very gently and called the pup off. I carried a rifle for a few days after that, but abandoned the practice because it got in the way too much. A thrashing or two served to discourage Flynn from chasing deer, or perhaps he couldn't be bothered with anything that ran faster than he did. Stan said a dog that chases the deer on your block can cost you half your tally because it makes them more weary and harder to stalk. Stan's few days had become 3 weeks by the time we reached the top of the ridge, where we found we still had a big stretch of cutting along to the main range. I was surprised to find areas of open tussock up there, and the purpose of the track became apparent. We saw 9 deer in one mob and had no rifle. I was impatient to get back on the shooting again. By this time we were walking for 2 hours up the part of the track we'd finished, cutting for another 6.5 hours, and walking an hour and a half back to the hut. It was a hard day's work, but I didn't mind as long as I was going to get in amongst the deer on those tussock clearings. It was magnificent up there, with a view such as I'd never seen in my life before. Mountainous ridges, scarred with huge shingle slides, piled as far as you could see in every direction, and the open tops were full of basins and gullies that I was bursting to explore. "Everything in this direction is yours," said Stan, waving towards an endless expanse of bush and tussock. "The other party has all the stuff back this way, and if you're caught poaching on each other's blocks, you'll be put on track cutting for the rest of the season." I was a bit impatient with the extra care Stan took to make certain no one could mistake the right track and go off down one of the wrong branches we'd cut. Later, I was to appreciate what it means to get off a track in dirty weather and spend a night in the bush. It's far from funny when you feel the darkness sifting through the beeches, lost on a ridge, beyond reach of camp and sleeping bag, fire and food. By the time we finished that track, we'd been at it nearly a month, but Stan said we'd make up for the lost time by being able to get up there, shoot all day, and return to our camp in the valley at night. That wasn't good enough for me. I was going to put a camp right on the spot. Stan reckoned it would be pretty miserable at that height in the dirty weather, but I still wanted to camp there, thinking of all the extra hunting I could get in the early mornings and late evenings. Stan gave me a hand to pack the tent and food up to the tops, and then left me alone, saying he'd see me in a month or so and bring me a mate. I built a fairly comfortable camp in a patch of bush beside a spring in a sheltered gully and hunted, away at dawn and back in the dark. I was going to prove to Jim that I was a good keen man. For his breed, that is, for a cross between bull terrier, blue merle, beardy, pointer, Scotch terrier, and cattle dog, Flynn was a tractable dog, and it was little trouble making him stay close in, where I could keep an eye on his eager sniffings into holes, logs, banks, clumps, and hollows. He didn't know what he was hunting for, but that was incidental. He was hunting, tail waving bravely in the air, and one ear pricked permanently, the other flapping over one eye. He paraded ahead, like the drum major of a very important parade. The river crossings knocked him back a bit, but he was game enough and followed anywhere I led him. Once or twice he tried to cross at bad places and got swept away round a bend. He usually managed to get across without assistance, and by the end of the first day he was getting the idea of crossing in wide, shallow places above the rapids, instead of plunging recklessly into deep, swift currents where the river narrowed. An hour downstream from the hut, I saw a sow rooting around on a landslip across the river, providing a good chance to see how the pup was going to take to the idea of bailing pigs. I sketched him towards where the sow had buried her snout in the ground, under a log, and he splashed across the river and stood sniffing the air looking back to see what I wanted him to do. I waved him on, and he ran a bit farther and caught the scent. His tail stiffened, his hackles rose, and he lifted one front paw in honor of his pointer ancestor. I whistled to get his attention, and waved him across towards the sow, still digging under her log. The pup trotted suspiciously up to within 5 yards of her, and turned to look back at me. I waved him on again, and he circled the sow cautiously. Then he gave a timid bark. The pig looked up and saw him, stared blackly for a moment at my savage pig dog, and went on digging for fern roots. I'd never been so insulted. The pup barked again, and the pig suddenly gave a loud woof, and chased him, yelping his head off, down the bank and across the river. This was too much altogether. I ran over and sullied the dog after the trotting sow, yelling and barking to show him what to do. The pig broke into a rough canter, and bolted through the bush with Flynn in full cry behind her. I followed after them, and found them dashing round after one another on a small bush flat. It was hard to tell which was chasing which, but the pup was rapidly getting the idea that respectable dogs don't take that kind of impertinence lying down. I stood back out of the way, while Flynn tried in turn the methods of all his various breeds to bring the pig to order. All that is, except the bull terrier, which only came to the fore after I'd finished the contest for him with the rifle. He bravely fought the carcass until even he realized it was dead, then strutted around as though he'd done it all by himself. He was most reluctant to leave when I whistled him to follow me down the river. Flynn, with his heavy head and unlikely patches of white in his blackened tan, wasn't the most promising pup I've had, but since he hadn't been running with older, more experienced dogs, I couldn't reasonably expect better from him. Even the presence of another young dog would have been better encouragement than a man lumbering about, trying to bark like a dog, and noisily skitching and sulling. Few pig dogs, even trained ones, hunt well on their own. They seem to feel more confident in packs, and a good keen dog often proves worthless without the support even of useless mates. No, my pup hadn't done too badly with his first pig. It wasn't long before I found that deer don't hang about in the open once you start thrashing a place, and it became necessary to go farther and farther along the range before I started getting a few shots. 4 skins a day dwindled to 3, and then to 1 or 2. I returned to the hut for the fly tent and camped a few hours along the range. But the extra deer I got only made a temporary difference to my tally. The place needed a spell for a while. I trimmed my dry skins and bundled them in lots of 20. There were 64, and I felt rather pleased with myself. It took me 3 trips to get them down to the hut, where I proudly ranged them under the skin fly. I kept going back to look at them and shift them around. God help the blowfly I caught on my skins. Stan called to spend the night on his way into the office. He had a look at the day book and said I wasn't doing too badly, but the blokes on the other side had over 100 each. He took my bundles of skin with him when he went and said he'd bring a mate for me next time, to see all the evidence of my skill and hard work carelessly counted out of the skin fly and casually thrown into the truck was a great disappointment. I returned to the camp up the river and hunted there for 2 weeks. Then I took the fly tent and camped at the head of the valley. I did all right for the first few days, but by the end of the week I was lucky to get 1 deer in a full day's hunting. The bush was too thick to shoot in, and the open patches along the river bank were few and far between. I shot around the hut for a week, then packed a load of supplies and ammunition up to my camp on the tops, and did the whole lot all over again. I worked hard and thoroughly enjoyed it most of the time, but it was a bit uncomfortable at the tops when the weather played up on me. One day I found the barrel of an old muzzle-loader gun in a half-circle of rocks at the end of a clearing which must have been a Maori camp at one time. The spot was off the track a bit, and you'd only go there if you were looking for somewhere to camp or to boil the billy, as I was. I sat by the fire that night rehearsing bargainings with the museum people for fabulous prizes for a musket that was probably ablaze on the trail of New Zealand history. I could see headlines in the papers: "Deer color unearths priceless relic of Maori," and telegraphs tapping out, "The mysterious Uruwera country has surrendered one of its secrets." A hunter in the untrodden waste of the largest unbroken expanse of bush in the southern hemisphere has brought back yet another link with times long past. I got quite carried away with myself. With all the care that was posterity's due, I scraped the dirt and rust off the musket and crawled into my sleeping bag, working out what I was going to do with all the money. The dream wasn't quite so real next morning. Somehow daylight disagreed with it, so I propped my relic across the fire to hang the billy on. I think it's still being used as a poker in one of the huts. When next I saw Stan, I had a tally of 185 deer, but he told me the blokes in the other valley had over 200 each. There was a shortage of hunters, he said, but he'd try and bring a mate for me next time without fail. I went at it harder than ever, and seldom saw my camps in daylight. I poached on the other party's block, and rolled the carcasses into gullies and creeks, where I covered them with fern. I shot deer along the roadside in the early mornings, till the mill workers complained about my flogging all the handy meat. I even thrashed the bush line at the back of the farms, out at the main road, and was chased on several occasions by angry cow-cockies. In April, the stags started roaring, and I stalked them in the bush, up the valley, and on the tops. getting an average of 3 a day. 3 stag skins were about as many as I could carry, and sometimes it took me as long as half an hour to knife one skin off. So towards the end of the season, I lost a bit of my enthusiasm and took only the tails of some of the tougher ones. I finished the season, still without a mate, in the middle of May, with 378 deer and 31 pigs to my credit. Flynn was a semi-reliable pig dog, and I was an experienced deer culler. Jim came to collect me and the gear, and seemed quite pleased with my effort. "By the way, Crump," he said on our way into town, "did you see anything of that bloke who's been shooting at the back of the farms along the road? Been scaring all the stock and leaving skinned carcasses in paddocks?" "Wonder I never saw him," I said. "Who'd get up to that sort of thing?" Jim looked sideways at me. "Don't come at it too often," he said. "I've got to pacify all the cockies who came stamping into the office about it. How many did you get, by the way?" "About 30, I think, Jim." Might be a good place to pick up some handy dog tucker sometime." I ran across the 2 men from the other block in a pub 2 days after the season ended. They'd got just under 400 deer between them. I'd got nearly as many on my own, thanks to Stan's saying they were beating me. "We got all the dirty weather on our side," one of them said, "and I reckon somebody was doing a bit of poaching too." "Poaching?" I looked mildly interested. "Yes," said the other. "We heard shooting up on our tops about 3 weeks ago." "That's funny," I said. "I thought I heard a couple of shots up there myself." "Not yours, I suppose?" one of them asked, grinning at me. I looked at him indignantly. "Not likely. I'd enough to do on my own block. Must have been private shooters. I put the money for another round on the bar, and nothing more was said." That healthy outdoor life. The deer I shot, the pigs my crackerjack dog caught, the loads I carried, and the rivers I crossed that first season doubled themselves effortlessly in the public bars I hunted in for the next 3 weeks. The only thing that didn't increase with time was my roll of skin money. A thirsty audience gave me the slight encouragement I needed to recount everything worth recounting with trimmings. The image which emerged was that of a tough, practiced, hard-drinking deer culler. Crafty old boars and 12-pointer stags fell all over the place. Rifle barrels sizzled and buckled with the heat as I slipped on mounting piles of empty shells, and instantly corrected my aim. I strewed the Uruwera from one end to the other with a broad trail of carcasses, while my audience listened with an occasional "Go on, did you?" and willingly drank my beer. After 3 weeks of town life, when I was beginning to believe my own stories, Jim rescued me from a bar and sent me down to a possum block in the Rahines for the winter. There, for the next few weeks, my new mates and I turned experience upside down. The admirers who'd surrounded us in the towns turned out to have been exclusively women, and good-looking women at that. In town, we'd cut a swath in the bush. In the bush, we conquered the town. I was just 17. There'll be some good keen men with you this time, Crump, Jim had told me. If you hold your own with this lot, you'll be doing all right. There were 4 of us, Alan, Jack, Dick, and myself, under a field officer called Bruce, who hardly came near us all season. Working from the same hut at first, we laid cyanide lines up every ridge within reach of the camp. The dodge was to work in pairs, one laying blobs of flour flavored with oil of aniseed for bait, the other adding crushed cyanide to each heap of flour. We'd do this for 3 days, then go back over the lines, cutting the ears off the dead possums for tokens. Sometimes we got 300 off one line, but the average was about half that. Like most wild animals introduced to New Zealand, the possums had become a pest. According to a shepherd from down the river, there hadn't been a possum in the district 5 years before, but by the time Jim classed it as a critical area, all the bush faces were spotted with the dead branches of trees. The fast-breeding animals had stripped bare. There wasn't a live 5-finger or mongio left in the valley. Once it had been difficult to climb through dense undergrowth on the ridges, but a few generations of deer eating the young trees before they were more than a few inches high, browsing on the undergrowth and chewing at the bark quite high on some of the smaller trees, had altered that. Pigs scoffing the roots and berries and breaking up the ground had triggered soil erosion. Then possums crawling all over the older trees, eating the bark and stripping the leaves, completed the job of making fine bush into potential desert. You could stand almost anywhere in this forest and see at least 100 yards through trees completely unsupported by undergrowth or saplings. The old forest was being killed off, and the new one literally nipped in the bud. The country's possum score for the year was about 560,000, but even this mass slaughter didn't seem to cut them down much. Later, when the extermination campaign got properly underway, the total was to be around 1 million yearly without any sign of possums getting scarce. The 4 of us had plenty of work to do, but we were young and fit and still found time for horseplay. Alan, a shy sort of chap, was unlucky enough to be experiencing his first taste of bush life, and became the butt of more than his share of camp humor. A beard he was fondly cultivating was fertilized while he slept, with applications of condensed milk or golden syrup. Or he'd climb into his sleeping bag only to burst out of it a moment later, under the spur of a hidden bouquet of stinging nettle. But we all got caught, one way of another. Dick came into the hut one day with an open tin of potassium cyanide, and we were indignantly telling him to take the blasted stuff outside when he tripped on a fallen stick of firewood and sprayed the poison everywhere. We all rushed to the door and scrambled our way outside. I was still holding my breath when Dick, in tears of laughter, told us we'd been put to flight by a handful of salt. The only one not too shaken to laugh. Dick said he was just finding out how many of his mates would stay to help him if he ever tripped over with a real tin of cyanide. One cold night, after his fourth daubing with golden syrup, Alan woke in such a rage that we all bolted from the hut, followed by flying bits of firewood and tin plates. We shivered in the cold at a safe distance while Alan stoked up the fire to heat some water for what was becoming an habitual after-dinner wash. Then we sneaked round the hut and legged Dick up with a 4-gallon tin of water, which he dumped down the chimney, dousing the fire and filling the hut with ashes and steam. The surrounding ridges echoed and re-echoed to Alan's curses. He came to the door and shouted into the frosty dark that he'd gut shoot the first of us to come near the hut. The click of a bolt closing convinced us of the discretion of retiring up the river a couple of 100 yards. We lit a fire and discussed how we were going to get our sleeping bags. Jack said someone should show himself to distract Alan's attention, while the others nipped in and grabbed our scratchers. But even the support given this suggestion by the intense cold failed to inspire any volunteers. After an hour of reassuring each other that Alan wouldn't really take a shot at us, Dick crept up to the hut, and from behind the log, about 20 yards away from the door, yelled, "Hey, Alan, Crumpet's cut his foot on a bone, and we can't stop the blood." The door flew open instantly, and orange muzzle flame stabbed out as a shot blasted into the darkness. Dick passed us at a smooth velocity that Jack reckoned would see him in a warmer climate by daylight, but he crept back a few minutes later, hissing like a mating possum, to attract our attention, and asking if it was safe before coming into the firelight. It was nearly midnight when Alan yelled from the hut that we'd better come in and have a brew. With Dick cautiously in the rear, we trooped stiffly inside, where mugs of hot tea were lined up on the table with a pile of toast. Noting that Alan's rifle leaned harmlessly in the corner with the others, Dick mumbled something about not being able to take a joke. Alan had resumed his usual quiet manner, and just smiled into the fire. We thawed ourselves a bit and hit the sack, to find our sleeping bags half full of prickly fur that Alan must have stripped from a tree fern while we shivered up the river. After a couple of hours of scratching and turning, Alan suggested we turn our bags inside out. Dick growled, "It's a bit over the odds, this," and Alan grinned. "Can't take a joke, eh?" he said. Next morning he shaved off his young beard, but he might have kept it for all the syrup pouring we were going to do after that. It was a carefree camp, and an argument over the ownership of a stray sock, or whose turn it was to get up first in the morning, could last for hours, with no hard feelings at the end of it. Dick had bought a mongrel from a private shooter for a handful of ammunition and spent weeks training it as a watchdog to warn him of approaching field officers on wet mornings. He eventually got the cringing brute to bark and snap ferociously every time he went near it. The dog remained on friendly terms with everyone else, including field officers. A month in the bush round the hut saw it thoroughly covered by poison lines, so Alan and Dick stayed there to clean up the area with traps, while Jack and I put in a camp along the valley and worked the country there. Freezing wet weather held up the work for 2 weeks, and Jack and I sat round the fire in our tent, telling yarns and playing poker for ammunition. When the weather cleared, we laid poison on a few of the handy ridges and then packed everything back down the river to the hut. There were practically no possums anyway. Too cold for them too, most likely. But when Bruce brought another load of supplies and found the 4 of us working the 150 traps near the hut, he wasn't at all pleased. He sent Jack and me back up the river to cut a track from the head of the valley over the top of the back ridge and onto a road halfway down the other side. We packed our gear and tentage back where we'd just brought it from. We'd cut the track halfway up the first ridge. When the weather, which had been teasing us for a week, suddenly broke and gave our valley something to go on with. Storms lasting for days lashed the bush until we wondered how the trees could remain standing. Some of them didn't. Then it poured steadily with rain, and you could almost see the river rising. Everything in the camp was wet. Tobacco went moldy. All the cigarette papers stuck together, and our damp clothes steamed when we sat near the fire, which was most of the time. The air was so moist we couldn't even keep ourselves dry, and we dared not let the fire die for fear that our damp matches wouldn't light the damp kindling we had stacked round inside the damp fireplace. We took it in turns to get up in the night and throw more wood on the fire. The graveyard effects of enforced idleness, solitude, and shortages of food and tobacco began to hang round the camp like a gray mist. Recipes for rice and meat were cooked and eaten without comment. Knives were honed to scalpel sharpness, only to be blunted again by opening tins. Games became more and more desultory and petered out. I rigged up a ponga kennel for Flynn beside the tent, but he stayed as wet and miserable there as he'd been under his bank. We gave up playing poker for cartridges, and in case one of us won too many and aggravated the already scratchy atmosphere. Each of us knew almost all there was to be known about the other, and liked each other the less for that. Jack's continual complaints got on my nerves, until I sat down disgustedly on my wet bunk and started working out what I was going to say to him about it. Then I noticed he was sitting on his bunk, probably thinking out ideas of a similar kind. I sensed his hostility when the pile of firewood I'd cut one day was possibly an inch or two smaller than the one he'd cut the day before. I hastily grabbed the axe and went out in the rain to get more. I was shorter of tobacco than he, but we'd passed the stage when a man asked for or was offered a smoke, and to have swiped one would have been dangerous to our delicate relations. Both of us should have known the conditions were entirely responsible for our unreasonable bitchiness, but that didn't stop us feeling bitchy. The look on Jack's face when he woke in the morning to hear the wind and rain still wearing away at the tent became more and more murderous. Our tinned food was low, and I fed Flynn the occasional tin of bully beef only in the dead of night, and with all the nervous care of an apprentice burglar. It had to end soon. One night, a sudden silence woke us. It was the first time we'd been able to talk without shouting above the wind for nearly 3 weeks, and Jack had a look out the door to see if any stars were showing through. It was snowing. By morning, there were about 2 feet of snow in the bottom of the valley. Jack cut firewood while I went out to see if I could get a deer for meat. I walked up the river bed until I found marks where a deer had crossed the flats, and followed them up into the bush. The snow crunched loudly under my boots, and I was just going to give up and go back when I spotted a stag through the trees. He had either seen or heard me, and was plowing around the side of a hill. I gave a loud yell, and when he stopped to look round, my bullet caught him fair in the brisket. He plunged forward a few yards, and then rolled down the hill. At last we had fresh meat, and it wasn't likely to go bad on us either. Snow started to fall again. While I was hanging all the meat I couldn't carry in a tree, and I made it to the camp just ahead of the worst storm we'd had yet. Embers from the fire blew all over the tent, and we rushed about stamping on them till the wind dropped. An hour and a half later, and the rain took over. It rained all that night, all the next day, and the day after that, the day after that, and the day after that. The river rose to within 10 feet of the camp, and we prepared to evacuate. Then the rain stopped, and the wind blew again, whipping sheets of water off the river, and spraying the camp with them. Then it rained again. Then more wind. Then another fall of snow came, and everything froze solid, even the wind. We'd had half a day's respite in 6 weeks of continuous dirty weather, and now the whole valley was white and silent and frozen. We loaded everything into our packs and crunched off down the river. We saw 3 small mobs of deer crossing the river bed, but my hands were too cold to work the bolt of my rifle, and Jack was too interested in getting back to the hut to worry about them. The thick, hard crust of the snow had bruised half the skin off our shins by the time we reached the hut. The place was deserted, and a note on the table informed us that the possum campaign in the area had been called off because of adverse weather. Nice of them to let us know.